Good afternoon. Welcome to episode 51 of Duval Rundown. My name's Gus Logue. Today I'll be joined by Hays Carlyon to go over each of our top 5 lists for head coach candidates we want to see running the Jaguars in 2025 and beyond. Before we get to that, we'll start with some Jaguars trivia, as we always do. The Jaguars have won 30% of games since Shad Khan purchased the team in 2012, which is the worst mark in the league. Who is the only team with the worst point differential in that span? Is it the Cleveland Browns, the New York Giants, the New York Jets, or the Washington Commanders? You got a guess, Hays?
I'll go Cleveland.
Cleveland's right there for sure, but it's actually the New York Jets, which is funny, especially for Shad's comments about Aaron Rodgers yesterday during his presser with Trent Baalke. Of course, if you haven't heard, Shad Khan retained Trent Baalke as general manager, but he did fire Doug Peterson as head coach of the Jaguars. And so spent plenty of time talking about Trent Baalke yesterday, including on this show with me, O'Brien. You can check out episode 50. But today we're going to go over head coach candidates, specifically our top 5 lists for who we want to see be hired. So Hays, first of all, thanks for joining the show. But if you want to go ahead and start us off with your number one guy for who you want to see coaching the Jags.
Yeah, sure thing. First off, thank you for having me on, and I want to apologize to you. I feel terrible about last week. You were very nice. My mom had a medical thing, and she's fine now, but I apologize for not being able to be with you last week. For me, the number one guy has got to be Ben Johnson. It's chalk, but you just look at what he's been able to do with Detroit, and the offensive numbers are outstanding. There's a creativity to it. There are difficulties with how Shad Khan is elected to play this, because I think Trent Baalke is an overall net negative in terms of this search. So I'm a little leery of guys that are inexperienced, because you're going to need to have some political savvy to your game here to have a chance of success. Because the new head coach walks in on day one and it's 1 against 2, because it's clear from Shad Khan's comments that Trent Baalke is not a general manager here. He is a partner. It's almost like Shad Khan can't even imagine, like the idea of firing Trent Baalke has never even entered his mind to do. Right. So it's a very unusual setup. And I think that's going to require a tough-minded head coach. So I think it's a difficult challenge, but Ben Johnson, certainly with his offensive acumen, I think has to be at the top of the list. Now, can he lead men? Is he going to be able to deal with the situation here? That's a big challenge, big question mark. But just because of his now multiple phenomenal years with Detroit, I think I'd have to give him the clear number one option. And if it ends up being Ben Johnson, I mean, Ben Johnson and Trent Baalke, hey, that's fine. A lot of the negativity from yesterday, I think, gets erased. If they can get Ben Johnson to Jacksonville, I just have doubts that this is where Ben Johnson will ultimately land because of the situation with Trent Baalke being retained.
Yeah, I totally hear you. The Jaguars did officially request to interview Ben Johnson, though. The Jags also have requested to interview Kellen Moore, the Eagles offense coordinator, Todd Monken, the Ravens offense coordinator, Joe Brady, the Bills offense coordinator, Liam Coen, the Bucs offensive coordinator, Ben Johnson, as we've said, Aaron Glenn, the Lions defensive coordinator, Patrick Graham, the Raiders defensive coordinator, and Robert Saleh, the former Jets head coach. So those are the names of the guys who are not yet been interviewed, but on the Jaguars' list of guys that they want to interview. I think Ben Johnson has to be at the top of their list. He's at the top of my list too. And I totally hear what you're saying about his lack of experience. It's obviously a risk when you're hiring any first-time head coach. But I think kind of a silver lining on Ben Johnson's resume is just where he's come from. Because when you're getting first-time head coaches, you generally want them to come from great organizations, or organizations that at least have a great leader or a great head coach. And Detroit certainly has one in Dan Campbell, who's kind of the culture setter of all culture setters. And that's definitely, I think, the question for Ben Johnson is not just his lack of head coaching experience in the NFL, because he's never been one before, but also whether he can be kind of that leader of men, that culture setter, the guy that pushes everyone, not just on the offense, but on the entire roster to be the best version of themselves. Remains to be seen, but with the body of work that he's had in Detroit, I think he's definitely worth being the number one guy. Just one more question for you about Ben Johnson before we move on. What would you say excites you most just when you watch the offense? Is it how good he makes Jared Goff look with like his crazy high completion percentage, how he weaponizes Penei Sewell, how he uses Gibbs or Amon-Ra St. Brown? Is there a certain part of watching the Lions offense that sticks out to you and excites you the most?
The thing I like about it is it's physical, but it's fun. So it's the best of both worlds. And what he's done with Jared Goff is certainly remarkable. This is a player that Sean McVay is an offensive wizard, but he felt like, look, this guy's reached his ceiling with me. We need to move on. We're not going to be able to get the ultimate goal with him. And the trade worked for both sides. The Rams get Stafford, they win the Super Bowl. But Goff was sort of thought to be almost like an afterthought of that trade. And we're throwing in Jared Goff. And what Ben Johnson's been able to do with Jared Goff, I think gives you a lot of hope if he's here that he can do the same thing with Trevor Lawrence. I think Goff and Lawrence are wired kind of the same way. And I think they kind of play the same way. I can visualize Trevor Lawrence doing the things Jared Goff does in that scheme. So yes, you love the laterals and I think that keeps guys engaged. They look forward to a Wednesday practice. What's coach going to have for us this week? I think that's really important in the grind of an NFL season of keeping guys engaged. But it starts with a physical brand of football, which they've got to establish here. So physical and fun, I think, is a potential special combination here in Jacksonville if they can land Ben Johnson.
Totally. Yeah, I guess that is another kind of question mark for his resume. I don't think that the amount of playmakers in Detroit should be a hinge on him because I think he's getting the most out of the playmakers that are up there. It's not like the playmakers are carrying him or anything close to it, but they definitely do have one of the best offensive lines in the league up there in the Motor City. And so I think that'll be a question of like how good is his scheme going to look without one of the best offensive lines? Because even if the Jaguars make a leap next year, they would be making a leap to be like a league average or slightly above average offensive line. They're not automatically going to turn into a powerhouse, or at least you wouldn't assume that would happen. But yeah, the thing that sticks out to me is the laterals and the trick plays, because there's a ton of like in-depth scheme stuff that he's amazing at. And as you said, it starts with physicality. There's a ton of different things that are impressive about what he's done with the Lions offense. But to me, after watching Doug Peterson and Press Taylor try to coach up a bunch of trick plays and them very rarely working, Travis Etienne had the game-winning run against the Chargers in the playoffs, and then he had a wildcat run against the Colts last year. But other than that, there's been a ton of turnovers and just negative plays when the Jaguars do try to run trick plays or laterals and stuff like that. And so to me, obviously it seems like it's a lot of fun for the players and the team to be able to pull off stuff like that, where just last week, Amon-Ra St. Brown caught a pass and lateraled it to Jameson Williams for a long touchdown on a hook and lateral. And just the attention to detail and the fact that those plays are working, not even the fact that they're being called, but the fact that those plays are working so well is what really excites me about Ben Johnson and what that means in terms of communications and details and stuff like that. So we both got Ben Johnson as our number one guy. Who's number two on your list?
Yeah, you start us off. Who's your number two guy?
I've got Liam Coen, the Bucs offensive coordinator. I think that the team should probably lean towards offense in general, just because they do have a franchise quarterback in place with Trevor Lawrence. And I think that Liam faces a lot of similar questions as Ben Johnson, where he hasn't been an NFL head coach before. Not quite sure if he's the quote-unquote leader of men type, where he can change Jacksonville's culture for the better, as in addition to changing the offense for the better. But I just have no doubts that he would change the offense for the better, because what he's been able to do with Baker Mayfield, again, kind of similar to Ben Johnson, where Ben Johnson turned around Jared Goff's career. Baker Mayfield's career has been turned around in Tampa Bay, and partly because of Dave Canales, who's now the head coach for the Panthers and was the Bucs offense coordinator in 2023. But this year, Liam Coen has done a spectacular job. He's especially been doing well when injuries have kind of forced them to change game plans. Chris Godwin was lighting the league up and was generally one of the best receivers through the first month or two of the season. But then, unfortunately, he had a season-ending injury in the way that Liam Coen was able to adapt and get K. Dotton more involved, get the rookie Bucky Irving more involved. He really improved with the offensive line, too, in the interior run blocking and run success. And so it's just been one of the best standalone performances of the season is Liam Coen in Tampa Bay this year. And so I think he would be the next best option behind Ben Johnson to pair with Trevor Lawrence in the Jaguars long term.
I like the idea of an offensive guy. Liam Coen to me it's a little bit more of a risk because he just doesn't have a lot of NFL experience, and so that's a concern for me. His first job in the league, 2018, he's an assistant receiver coach with the Rams for a couple of seasons. In 2020, he moves to assistant quarterbacks with the Rams. So we're 2020, and he still hasn't even been a position coach in this league. He then goes back to college, comes back to the Rams in 2022 as an offensive coordinator under Sean McVay, obviously. 23, back in college, and then this season. And he's done an outstanding job. I mean, you're absolutely right. If what he has shown this year in Tampa Bay is what he is, then obviously he's a bright star, up-and-coming star in this business. I would be a little worried about him being a head coach this early. It feels like to me he needs a little bit more seasoning in this league, a little bit more savvy in this league, seeing a little bit more of the league. So I wish the resume is flimsy. Now again, he may end up being the best of this bunch. So I have more concerns about Coen than I do about Johnson. Johnson's just been in the league longer and has been able to show over multiple seasons that he can be a really successful offensive coordinator. But certainly Liam Coen from an offensive perspective, yes, if he could harness what he's been able to turn Baker Mayfield into with Trevor Lawrence, then obviously I think that'd be a big positive for the Jaguars. But I do worry about just his lack of NFL experience in terms of the years on the resume. I honestly, I think that once I get beyond Ben Johnson, I now kind of focus on the other aspect of the Jaguars that was sorely lacking under Doug Peterson, which is toughness, edge, grit. There just was none of that. Sorry, my cat's deciding to knock a bunch of stuff off the wall here. But I think as I look at it, yes, they need an offensive guru, ideally. But if they can't get the best one, I survey the other offensive minds, and I have some pause. So for me, and I don't think that this is going to happen because I think his destination is secured in New England, but he is on the market. So my number 2 guy, at least for now, is Mike Vrabel. He is somebody that I think comes in, sets a tone. The Jaguars have lost all their toughness. I mean, obviously these are tough men. They play in the NFL. I'm not questioning that they're not tough men. But what I am questioning is compared to their peers, the other men that play in this league, how do they compare from a toughness standpoint? And I don't think it's really there. And I don't think Doug Peterson really instilled that in them. He tried. I mean, he ran what he thought were hard training camps, but it never translated. And exhibit A of this is when Trevor Lawrence gets cheap shotted, and there was very little retaliation at all other than from, Evan Ingram and Jarian Jones, Brenton Strange, but way too many guys that didn't. And then you play an entire second half and they didn't even get close to CJ Stroud. I mean, it was like, where's the fire here? This was an insult to you, to your pride, to your dignity, what they did to Trevor Lawrence. And then Doug Peterson's hugging D'Amico Ryans after the game and basically blaming Jarian Jones. And meanwhile, the Texans are saying the Jaguars overreacted. I just thought you don't often get such a striking example of a lack of toughness with a team. That to me really showed a just lack of this. The Jaguars are just not a team that can go and win a street fight right now. And I mean that between the lines. Now, obviously, with the cheap shot, that was after the play and things like that. But between the lines, show some fight. And it just wasn't there. So I'd like it to be Ben Johnson. I don't know that he can do that, but he's such a good offensive mind. I think you hope that he can. If I can't get Ben Johnson, I'm now starting to focus more on that toughness element, physical element, and the Jags not being a total pushover like they've been for the last year and a half.
Yeah, I feel like the secondary needs a lot of work, but I think the general consensus in Jacksonville is that the Jaguars need to upgrade the trenches this offseason on both sides of the ball. And I wonder how much getting a Mike Vrabel or that kind of culture setter in the building to add the physicality and grit that you're talking about, how much that alone would be able to boost those units and make it a better football team. And the thing with Vrabel, he's on number 3 on my list behind Coen, is that like the whole grit mentality is definitely like the thing that is his main characteristic, but it's not the only thing that makes him a great head coach. Like the guy for the Raiders, Pierce, has this kind of the same characteristic where he gets the most out of his guys, and it's a physical group. But Vrabel is also great at hiring coordinators. Shane Bowen was the Giants' defensive coordinator this past offseason, but he was in Tennessee for a while, and he's one of the guys that's going to be a name that pops up in the head coach candidate lists. He also hired Arthur Smith and Matt LaFleur, who went on to be NFL head coaches on the offensive side of the ball. He was really good at game management, like in-game management decisions too, which is sometimes rare for defensive-minded head coaches, just because defensive coaches are typically a little bit more conservative and almost try not to lose as much as they're trying to win. But Vrabel was really good at making in-game decisions. And so there's a lot of different things. And then probably more than anything else, maybe his biggest calling card is just that he's done it before and been there before. He's a former NFL Coach of the Year award winner. He took the Titans to multiple playoff appearances and won at least one game, if not multiple playoff games under his watch, even though Ryan Tannehill was the best quarterback that he had while being the Titans coach. And so there's certainly other quote-unquote culture builders on the list that we're going to get to, but the fact that Vrabel is that, but he's not that alone, and he's done it before at the NFL level, I think he's definitely one of the safest coaches on this list. So he's my number 3. Who do you have as your number 3 guy, Hays?
For number 3, I'm going to kind of stick in that mode, and I'm going to go Robert Saleh, who I think got a really raw deal in New York. Clown owner. Was saddled with obviously a miss at the quarterback position, at least for now. Maybe Zach Wilson goes on and becomes the next reclamation project in the NFL that's a big success. But for now, Zach Wilson's buried in Denver. He's not playing, and it doesn't appear like he's ever going to amount to anything, let alone being the second pick in the draft. I think Robert Saleh defensively brings a lot of good stuff to the table, and he's an exemplary person. From covering him when he was here, you couldn't have a better guy as your head coach from a bringing everybody together persona. So again, I want the offensive mastermind that's the experienced guy. But if Ben Johnson elects to go somewhere else, I think it's got to be somebody that can instill toughness and a physical mindset. I think Robert Saleh would do that. You look at the success that he had with the Jets on the defensive side of the ball. And again, I think Robert Saleh is incredibly well liked and well respected around the NFL. He is going to be able to find quality offensive coordinators to bring the best out in Trevor Lawrence. So I think a guy like Robert Saleh, who obviously I think would jump at the chance to get a second crack at being an NFL head coach, I think it lines up well. So he would be somebody that would be probably higher on my list than many others. But I think, again, I think a lot of the things that went wrong in New York were not Robert Saleh's fault. It's not Robert Saleh's fault that Aaron Rodgers tore his Achilles barely into a season of football. And I believe the Jets still won like 7 games with Zach Wilson in that year. And then obviously this year, I mean, he's 4 games into the season, and he gets fired. So obviously we know, he was dealing with a quarterback that probably had more influence on what was going on than what would be healthy for an organization. So, I think Robert Saleh is somebody, has head coaching experience, outstanding defensive coordinator as well. So I think brings that toughness and that edge. To me, this is how I look at the AFC South. It's a disaster.
Yeah.
And if you can be the toughest team in this division, you can win this division consistently. I don't think Houston is very. I don't think they're very skilled or very tough. Now they're the toughest, but I don't think that they are. I don't think they're in the top quadrant in this league. Tennessee is lost in the wilderness. The Colts appear to be close, like on the borderline of being lost in the wilderness, was certainly probably facing the middle of the wilderness more than facing, the prairie. Right. So I think in looking at it, if you can find a coach that can make the Jaguars the toughest team in this, I think they have enough skill, and they could certainly add to that. But they've got to find a toughness, and I think Robert Saleh could do that here.
Yeah, it definitely shows up when you watch the Jets defense over the past couple of years. They had a solid unit before he got there, but then as soon as he did get there, it transformed into a perennial top 5 unit. And then when he was fired early this season, there was a massive drop-off as soon as he was let go in terms of the defensive performance. And a large part of that is because of the amount of hustle on the defense. Like, it wasn't just that they were allowing more rushing yards on the ground or more yards in general, but they were allowing more broken tackles, more busted coverages, just more mistakes without him there to set the tone. And so I definitely think he's actually not on my top 5, but he's definitely an honorable mention for me. And I think similar to like how you're saying he's higher on your list, I think he's definitely going to be higher on Jacksonville's list than most other teams because he was a position coach here, coaching the linebackers under Gus Bradley. And as Mia said on yesterday's show, the Cons seem to view him as the one that got away, and he definitely has a good relationship with the Cons. And it's definitely no surprise that he's getting one of the first interview requests from the team. And to go with what you were saying about how well respected he is around the league, I certainly would trust him to make a solid offensive coordinator hire if he were hired as head coach. But I also think that if any of these offensive guys that the Jaguars could hire are hired as head coach, then Saleh would probably be the first pick as their defense coordinator for most, if not all, of the people who could do that. And so Saleh is absolutely a name to continue monitoring through the next couple of weeks, even if he isn't as popular for other teams. So we both got 3 down, I'm pretty sure. What is your 4th candidate for head coach of the Jaguars in 2025?
Well, I'll concede to you, Gus. So you lead us off. Who do you have at number 4?
I've got kind of going with a similar theme as Mike Vrabel and Robert Saleh. I've got Aaron Glenn as my 4th guy.
That's my guy too.
I really wanted to get him higher on the list, honestly, but it was tough for me to put him above Vrabes and Coen. But Aaron Glenn would be a home run hit. He has experience in Jacksonville as a player, and I think it was 2007 he played for the Jaguars as a defensive back, and then he grew up kind of in the Dennis Allen defensive system in New Orleans and brought it over to Detroit, where they're now thriving, which is especially impressive because of how many injuries they've had on that side of the ball. Obviously, their star pass rusher, Aiden Hutchinson, went down early in the year, but they've had a ton of other injuries throughout the season as well. And so the fact that he's doing so well with such a depleted unit is really impressive. And to me, like, he's everything that Ryan Nielsen wasn't, because Ryan Nielsen came in and you heard all about how his philosophy was attacking and aggressive. And then he really didn't do that. He played really conservatively, like with one of the lowest blitz rates in the league. He started out playing a decent amount of press, but because Tyson Campbell was the only formidable coverage defender, they moved away from that to more shell defenses. They would always have at least one safety over the top and really ran like cover zero all-out blitzes. And so it was really disappointing to see the conservativeness and the lack of aggression from Nielsen this year. And it was, I think, largely because of the lack of talent or the lack of dudes on the roster. But Glenn in Detroit has had the opposite approach, where even when there's bodies falling, he's still maintained a really aggressive approach with a lot of man coverage, a lot of press coverage, a lot of blitzes, the typical kind of just defensive approach you want to see from culture setters, where everyone's flying to the ball and no one's walking around. They have a really good, a really low broken tackle rate. And so he's definitely in that mold of a defensive guy who's also going to get the most out of his players. And I feel like he would, again, be a home run hit for Jacksonville.
I totally agree with everything you said. So I won't reiterate it all, but I think what you said about him, that's exactly how I feel about Aaron Glenn. I think he has done a marvelous job of dealing with attrition, which we know you're going to have to deal with that. Now, what Detroit's had to deal with is extraordinary on that side of the ball. But to hold Minnesota to 9 points the other night in one of the biggest games ever played in Detroit, maybe the biggest, certainly the biggest in many decades. It was incredibly impressive, and you love his demeanor. But that ability to get reserve players to step in and play at a high level is something we're not used to seeing here. So I fully endorse Aaron Glenn as well as being in the top five.
Yeah, I think all of these guys that we mentioned has shown the ability to develop players. Like the biggest example would probably be Robert Saleh, who made Quincy Williams an all-pro player after he was cut by the Jaguars. And so Glenn definitely falls in that category as well, just guys that are going to get the most out of their players, not just in terms of effort, but also in terms of talent development. So why don't you go ahead and give us your fifth guy on your list?
My fifth guy is Willie Taggart, Ravens running back scum. My fifth guy here is, let's see. I'm gonna go with Todd Monken. I'm gonna go back to the offensive side of the ball, and this is why I would have him maybe higher than Coen, Joe Brady. Again, I do think the general manager is a problem here. I think you need a guy with some gravitas that has seen some things. Todd Monken is in his late 50s. He's been in football a long time. He's Doug Peterson's age, or roughly. So I think it would help, and he's an unbelievably good guy. I think he's got the right mindset to come in and navigate the waters. And again, I'm not saying Trent Baalke's looking to sabotage these guys. Trent Baalke wants to win, and Trent Baalke's going to do all the right things initially. It's when adversity hits is where you get concerned. And again, that's why it was such a mistake what Shad Khan is elected to do, because you would love the head coach and GM to be in alignment. And it's we're in this together, and we're going to win together and be on the same timeline. And that's not what's going to be the case here. So I think it's going to be very hard for a first-time head coach and a very young head coach, somebody in their 30s, to come in and navigate these waters. Todd Monken, older guy, has head coaching experience in the college realm, but certainly has been doing an outstanding job in Baltimore with their offense. They definitely hit another level when he took on the job a few years ago. So I think a guy like Todd Monken, with his life experience and his offensive acumen, could be a good fit here for what is going to be a very unique situation with a general manager that basically we now know will never be fired here.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I think you laid that out really well. To me, Robert Saleh is a guy that's pretty obviously going to be higher on the Jaguars' list than people might expect. But I think an under-the-radar guy would be Todd Monken, is probably going to be higher on the Jaguars' list because of exactly what you just said. And to me, the biggest thing that stands out stands out about Monken, not just for the Jaguars' job, but in general, is how much he was able to elevate Lamar Jackson. I think that Lamar has always been an underrated passer, even going back to his Louisville days, and he really just needed a coach to be able to get the most out of him, and that's exactly what Todd Monken was able to do. Statistically, Lamar has been even better this season than he was in either of his previous 2 MVP seasons, and I think that the majority of credit does go to Todd Monken. I'm sure that they've added some talent at pass catchers, and Lamar, I'm sure, just individually was going to grow himself too. But Todd Monken, I think, has been the leading force behind Baltimore being a true Super Bowl contender this year and led by that offense. I also kind of struggled a little bit to come up with a 5th guy. There was a lot of names that I was choosing between. And I really came down to Todd Monken or Jesse Minter. So I'll go with Jesse Minter because I think that he's probably not going to be hired as a head coach this year, but he did great work with Jim Harbaugh's Michigan Wolverines when they won the championship, and before that too. And then he followed Jim Harbaugh this past offseason to the Los Angeles Chargers and has been putting on a great show as the defensive coordinator over there. And again, I don't think that Minter will end up being hired as a head coach this offseason, but I just firmly believe that he will be hired as a head coach at some point. And he has the type of defensive scheme that I think is really modern and what owners should be looking for if they are going to hire a defensive guy, which is what we talked about with Aaron Glenn, which is just being very aggressive. And even when you're kind of outmanned, matching that disadvantage with aggression as opposed to with conservativeness. And he's definitely got the aggression mark in terms of play calling, but also the culture mark in terms of players will play at their hardest for him. And like when you look at that Chargers roster, I don't think anyone was really giving them a shot to be in the playoffs. But all of a sudden, here they are. And certainly Jim Harbaugh and Justin Herbert deserve a ton of credit. But the way that Jesse Minter has coordinated that defense has been extremely impressive. And so I think that if like the first 3 or 4 names on the Jaguars' list get snatched up by other teams, then I think that they should consider taking a long and hard look at Jesse Minter, because even if he doesn't seem quite ready this year, I just think he's going to be a great head coach one day. And so you might want to try to snag him now while you can.
Yeah, I like that call.
The one last question I had for you was there's some rumors floating around, which I really don't believe at all. So take this with a grain of salt. But if Kevin O'Connell, the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, were somehow available for trade, just not necessarily what would you give up in a trade for him, but where would he rank on this list for you? Would he be your number 1 guy ahead of Ben Johnson or somewhere farther down?
I think he'd have to be, just because obviously what he's been able to do with Kirk Cousins and then Sam Darnold is extraordinary. And so I don't anticipate it happening. I don't know why the Vikings wouldn't just I mean, to me, that was put out by his people because they're probably a little disgruntled that he hasn't gotten the big extension yet. But the Vikings, I think the Vikings have good ownership. I'd be shocked if he's not going to be paid with the rate that he now deserves to be paid at. So I would expect a big raise coming for Kevin O'Connell in Minnesota. I mean, that's one of those moves. Think about it from their side. If you're the Vikings ownership and you trade Kevin O'Connell, how do your fans respond to that? I don't think they would respond very well at all to that. And so you just can't let that happen. And so I mean, if Minnesota picked up the phone and called the Jaguars and said, hey, we're interested in doing this and O'Connell is interested in this, then certainly I would pursue it. And I would pursue it with vigor. But I just don't see from Minnesota's side of that how that makes any sense at all. I think that story was put out there to put a little heat on Vikings ownership to give O'Connell the big raise that he deserves.
Yeah, well, the Jaguars have fleeced the Vikings in the past. Just last year, they traded down from number 17 in the draft to number 23 to be able to get Brian Thomas Jr. plus 2 midday draft picks. But yeah, I agree with you. I do not expect it to happen at all. But if it were to actually,
it's a fun topic.
Yeah, then I agree with you. I would have Kevin O'Connell at the top of my list. He definitely deserves to be the coach of the year this year, and he's definitely it'll be fun to see how far he's able to take the Vikings in the playoffs. But to recap our lists, my top 5 was 1, Ben Johnson, 2, Liam Coen, 3, Mike Vrabel, 4, and Aaron Glenn, in 5, Jesse Minter. You want to recap yours, Hays?
Sure thing. I've got Ben Johnson at 1, Mike Vrabel at 2, Robert Saleh at 3, Aaron Glenn 4, and Todd Monken 5.
There you have it. Those are the top 5.
And it will be none of those 5 men.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Now you know who not to look out for as the Jaguars' next head coach. But Hays, really appreciate you joining today. I thought that was a fun conversation. It'd be fun to watch how this all unravels over the next month or so. Me and I will be back on Thursday at 9:04 a.m. to go over a little fixing the franchise segment, just what we would do as armchair owner, I guess, or armchair general manager to put the 2025 Jaguars in the right direction for the offseason. So make sure to check that out Thursday. Thanks again to Hays. Thanks to everyone who watched and listened, and see you guys next time. Take care.
Gus, thanks so much for having me. Look forward to joining you again soon.
Appreciate it. All right, take care.